Hello, I'm Craig Constantine.
Hi, Craig. I'm Helena Roth.
Pleased to meet you. We were talking about a whole bunch of different things, blogging and podcasting. And you have some interesting methods that you use to select guests, or maybe I'm making it sound more intentional than it necessarily is. But we wanted to talk about conversation. And it's like I'm immediately aware that this could get really meta since we have not met previously other than this call. So we've known each other for about 11 minutes. So this could get very meta. That could be good or it could be bad. So do you find that when you start a conversation with someone that you don't know at all, do you find it easier to pick something to, like, we're going to have a guide star and I'm going to try and start there with the conversation? Or is it easier to just be completely random and just like riff, the first thing they say, and I'm going to say yes? And do you use either of those two methods that you lean on more than the other?
I would say it's more towards the other. Um, in my podcast, Tankespian with Helena Roth, the past season, I've had 5 guests that I've had 5 conversations with each, and there hasn't been an agenda. There hasn't been a set time frame. There hasn't been any. This is what we need to get through, or the goal we need to reach, or anything. And surprisingly, it's gone really well. I've done 25 of those, and one of them I actually brought a topic to the table because me and Allison, we had a non-recorded conversation where she'd said that she found it so uncomfortable to be on record,
Hmm.
to actually do the recording. So I said, could we talk about that? And she said, yeah. So that's the one time in 25 conversations that I've actually brought a topic to the table. But then that conversation went just everywhere anyway, but we did start off. But otherwise, it just comes. It's like, if nothing else, it's like, where are you at right now? You know, where are you at? How do you feel? What's happened? How has your day been? And off you go.
I definitely agree. For me, I agree. Yes, the conversation just comes, and I think I don't know if it's the same for everybody, but it just occurred to me. But for me, it's driven by curiosity. If I'm genuinely curious, then I'm listening to comprehend. I'm continuously distracted by that's interesting. That's interesting. All these ideas that even if somebody is trying to be very clear and very concise, I still see multiple branching points. I'm wondering if you have noticed, um, just like the more you do recorded conversations, the more you develop this superpower and you go out into the world as like a skilled person at cultivating conversations. And I'm wondering if you've ever seen people, maybe like you're in a group of 3 or 4 and you're watching a conversation happen in front of you. Does your, I'm going to say, does your power make you see things that, like, oh no, don't do that. Don't answer that way. Or do you find yourself noticing what other people are doing right and wrong in conversations?
Yeah, but I would say that that's a power or a judgment that I've had for a long time. And I'm a trained coach as well. So, the curiosity and the asking questions, and also the don't answer it for anybody else kind of
Hmm.
ethos is quite significant in me. So now and again, throughout the years, it's like I can listen to a podcast because it's easier kind of in a podcast. It happens, in 3D too, but
Right.
more often when I listen to a podcast where I go, why would you? It's like, don't answer. You just ask the question, let the other person answer, and don't, it's like, so the cutting short
Hmm.
of yeah, I get it, you mean this, and I'm going, how the f do you know that? Right? It's like, let them. So that can actually frustrate me now and again.
Mm.
Um,
I know what you mean, and now I'm thinking, yeah, is it worse in podcasts, like when I'm listening? And I'm thinking, before we pressed record, you and I were talking about what types of podcasts do we listen to, and I started heavily in the two people talking, modality of listening to people have a conversation. And I grew to be like, oh, I can't take it anymore. Like, and I moved
mm,
away from that. And now I'm getting into more, I'm going to say like creative host on mic, storytelling, and not necessarily fiction, but somebody unpacking some idea. And now I'm wondering, oh, wow, is that driven by me picking up on things in conversation that I disliked? And then I immediately went meta, like, wait, but just because I dislike it, does that mean I'm right? Like I should look at that more.
yeah.
So there are
Yeah.
so many things that open up when you start to pay attention instead of trying to do, whatever one might.
Yeah. And I just, a couple of weeks ago, I listened to Walter, no, what's his name? Walter Isaacson. Yeah, that's his name. He was on his podcast, which I don't listen to. I read a couple of his books and like them, but he was interviewed by Dan Rather, and it was like a 35 minute one. And I was listening, and my entire body was just chafing against this because it was
Mm,
so obviously not a conversation. It was so obviously, these are the questions I want you to ask me, and these are the answers that I will be giving. And I'm going, okay, we're talking transactional here. It's like, it just gets lifeless in
mm,
a sense. There's no vitality. There's no room for what wants to happen here. And it kind of, it's like, okay, here you are behind a lot of facades, and I'm actually interested in the people behind the facade.
mm. My first thought was, wait, I didn't know Dan Rather was still alive. But setting that setting that aside for a second,
I think it's quite old.
I think I dislike, per my personal choice of words, I dislike calling what I do interviews. And the problem is everybody else that I interact with calls them interviews. So what you and I are doing right now is an interview. And I'm like, well, I mean, nominally I'm the host and you're the guest. And she's shaking her head. No, I agree. This is not an interview.
No.
But some people like to call it that. And I think when I hear people do the classic, just the facts, ma'am, journalistic, I have a list and you picture them looking at their list while jotting down notes. There's a time and a place for that. Journalism is super important. But when that gets passed off as, join me on Tuesday for this great conversation with this person that is just so hard to get a hold of, and then I get a journalistic experience, like, why am I listening to that? You should turn those notes into the thing that you publish and I read or watch or whatever. And I just wonder if that's a fear. So sometimes I do conversations, and depending on who I'm talking with, the person may not be very open. And
Mm.
I'm never looking for dirt. But if I want to have a heartfelt conversation and somebody is closed off, it's like, well, I'm going to have to share more. Like I'm going to have to show up even more. I don't know, words fail. I have to be very present and really lean in. And then at the end, I'm like, whoa, I was talking about, suicide or, things that I don't normally tell people about. And I'm like, And I just wonder if maybe that journalism, like we could be nice and say that comes from habit. If you're trained as a journalist, you do 5,000 journalistic interviews, that's going to be your shtick. But I also wonder if it doesn't come from a place of fear where people are, yeah, as a coach, you have to be very comfortable. I don't know where this is going to go. So I'm just going to
Yeah.
ask questions, and I have to be
Yeah.
comfortable knowing that this is a well-intentioned space. And I just think I'm hoping people would eventually grow out of that if they're starting in that space, that type of interview or that type of conversation from a place of fear. Do you have any experience with anybody that you've seen do us, like, it can happen on the guest side? They, conversation, 3, 4, 5 in, they open up, they get more comfortable. They start asking you questions. It starts to become more two-way. Have you seen that happening in podcasters where they, kind of relax and find their stride?
Well, yeah, I think you can. I mean, again, I think that happens, and I think I've kind of listened to it. And it is, for me, a conversation is like there's two people who are of interest. Whereas if it's an interview,
That's a good
it's
way.
one person who's of interest, right? It's like I'm just asking questions, and I could be replaced by anybody who could ask questions.
A teleprompter, right?
A teleprompter could be asking the questions, and I could be responding. The guest could be
Yeah.
responding to them. But so, like you do now, it's like you don't start off with these are the questions that I always ask, right?
Right.
So it isn't an interview that way for me. But if you were clicking on just asking questions, you wouldn't do what you just did, which is share this meandering, the thought that goes and is like, and oh, here comes a question. It might not always be questions. It can just be kind of a statement or a reflection. And then, I can just pick up on whatever happens in me or with me or a thought I get or
Hmm.
something. But I've been, I do enjoy, I really like On Being with Krista Tippett. And even though I would say that is in many ways, there's a big part of interview aspect to it. But she does share herself. I feel like I've listened to
Yeah,
a lot
Krista's
of On
present.
Being, as
Yeah.
she is present, right? So it is the two people or three, however many it is. And it is that presence that I think that I'm looking for. That's the thing that kind of hooks me. It's like, again, like I say, when there's a person there, when I get to hear the person. Oh, there's one of the Krista Tippett's where she speaks to Ocean Vuong, who's a poet, author. Ah, just an
I
amazing
missed that one.
episode.
What's the
Oh,
person's last name again? Vaughn?
Vuong,
If,
Vuong, Vuong, Ng, probably Vuong,
hmm.
Vuong. Yeah, Ocean Vuong. It's an amazing because they are in a conversation, right? It's a couple of years old. I don't know, 4 or 5 years old,
I don't
probably.
recall seeing that one. I have obviously not listened to all of them.
Yeah, it's so good. I don't know how many times I've listened to that one. Because I do that. I re-listen to podcasts that I find interesting, and if they're conversations, I pick up on new things every time.
Hmm. Yeah. A couple of things that you said jumped out at me, and I'm like, oh, which one do I want to pull on? Um, and I usually like to pull on the one that I've never had a chance to talk about before. So you were talking about like the number of people, like it's a conversation between the host and a guest, which is that's my plate, mostly my sandbox. That's a lot of what Krista Tippett does. And I'm wondering, have you had the chance to either actually record or to just try and create conversation where you sort of show up as the chef, and because I've had a couple situations where I once had three ladies who had co-created a nonprofit organization, and everybody knew who these people were, but nobody ever really heard them because they're always behind the scenes doing all the hard work. And I got the three of them to sit down at one of their houses, and I had microphones for all of us, and I pointed mics at them, and it was the most magical conversation. I basically just sat back. And I'm like, every once in a while I'd be like, tell me more about that. And they would just keep going, and they just had the conversation was self-sustaining, and I wasn't present. I'm just wondering if you've had any experiences like that, maybe where either you did it on purpose for a recording, or maybe just like in a cafe or some scenario where you just decided to deploy your conversational skills for good and like cultivate the environment, but you're not actually the person engaging in the conversation.
Yeah, I've had that. I'm not so sure if I've done that in podcasting situations, but it has happened in other in other situations, and it is kind of thrilling now and again to do that. To kind of and to a large extent, that's a lot of what coaching can be too. You know, this you create this container, you set up the space, you know, you're an enabler in a sense.
Mm.
You pointed those microphones at these ladies and, you know, hands off. You don't have to do anything. But I wouldn't say that you're not present. You're just not voiced
Yeah.
there, right? But you're still there. You're still the one who's making part of that possible. Um, but I've come to the sort of to a point in life where I don't necessarily feel the need to add my 2 cents, you know. So my old me would add those 2 cents like all the time, right? I wouldn't not do that. Today, I don't have to do that. And that doesn't matter if it's in a, you know, if it's at a, you know, for work or in a podcasting conversation or just sitting around listening to people, you know, friends and family or anything. It's like, I don't always have to add my thing. You know, now and again I do, now and again I don't. And
Mm.
that's interesting. There's a sort of a conversation exercise that I've done when I've done leadership trainings where one person is the person who's sharing, speaking. The other is the person who prompts them if there's a need for it. And the third person is the dog, the one who just listens, who's not allowed to say anything. And it's so interesting. Some people will go, oh, I have 5 minutes to speak. I don't want to speak, you know, really uncomfortable being the one speaking. And then there's the people who go, I hate being the dog
Oh, no.
because I can't add my 2 cents. I'm not allowed,
Mm.
you know, bunny ears, to actually say something. But I want to tell them about this thing. And I had this experience. And oh, they need to check out this podcast or this book or, you know, no, you don't. You
Mm.
just sit with it. So it's interesting what happens in people when it comes to conversation and listening and sharing. And you know, it's like just knowing that, yeah, I could say something here, but I can just kind of send my love and my energy instead. You know, that'll
Yeah.
do fine. Just kind of relaxing into that has made life a heck of a lot easier.
Mm. Yes. Plus one. Um, I'm also thinking. So a couple minutes ago, when we were talking about Krista Tippett, and then before that, we were talking about stock questions. And I have some shows I do where there's like a stock question that goes on the end. I use it like a turn signal, like, okay, we're getting off the highway. And there's I'm oversimplifying, I think, but there's like two main ways to start recording a conversation. One way is to, before you press record, start talking a little bit. And then at some point, somebody's got to go, okay, stop. We need to press record. And I really think that there's, I don't think there's a great way to do it. Like, no matter how you do it, it's going to be just so. So Krista Tippett's, in my opinion, brilliance is she starts with a question asking about religion, and it generally gives, like, somebody has enough to say about that she can find the first thread in there. And it's like, yeah, okay, you're asking a stock question, and most of the answers that you hear are pretty, like, by now you've heard the same answer. You know, people only have, yes, they're all unique, but they pretty much give similar answers. So on one hand, you could just skip that part. We could just like have a pre-conversation and then we'll start with the good stuff, or edit off the, but then there's the other side of it, which is, for these conversations, I do the pre-conversation and then we try and stop and start again. And the second start is just as hard as the first start.
Yeah.
So I don't know that there's a real particular question there. It's just, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, and about like the conversations that you and I are talking about doing here are completely artificial in that we're creating it, and we're, you know, it's like cooking, like, you know, the souffle is not natural. But whether or not the souffle works, you know, there's some natural and randomness in that. And I'm just wondering what your thought, have you dove into that in terms of thinking about how to begin and how the beginning, there's a whole similar conversation for endings, but just what are your thoughts on how beginnings of conversations work when you're trying to record them?
I have learned, and I'm still learning, but basically have learned now that the minute, if I meet up with somebody at 9 o'clock, I press record and then we start, and, and one time, I don't know, conversation number 3 or 4 with Gary of the past season on my podcast was interesting because we got into this conversation and things and that. And 20 minutes in, he went, "Aren't you going to start to record?" And I went, "What the? Oh shit, man, no, bummer." So he's like,
Yeah.
and then that happens that it's like, okay, here we go. Here we start. We have just been having this conversation. Gary, you were saying just this thing. Could you please repeat it?
No. Yeah.
So it's like, I'd rather start the recording and have it. Kind of like I know Krista Tippett does also, her unedited has them doing the sound checks and the what did you have for breakfast today and those kind of things. It's like, okay, here I get into it. And I like that. I can, my podcast is basically not edited at all. I hit record, it goes to the end, my conversation partner leaves, and then I record the beginning, the intro, which my friend Caspian then cuts out and puts at the top, right? But basically that's it.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in your organic approach. And I agree. I have definitely had I should be recording this and I'm not for various reasons. So yeah. But I think my quest for perfection is inevitably my downfall. So if I don't screw up once in a while, I don't think I'm, trying hard. No. So I try to relax when I do inevitably screw up, but I would be mindful of our time and your time and our listeners' time. So I think that's a great place to stop for our first conversation, perhaps not our last.
Perhaps
Helena,
not.
thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.